Hello there and welcome back. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the process a visual effects shot will go through from just an inkling of an idea to a fully completed shot. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to be talking mostly about this shot right here as an example. It's going to take us around 2 weeks of class time to finish this shot, and that finished version will land in our hands around 6 to 10 hours of work. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that this shot did not take me 6 to 10 hours to make from scratch. In fact, it actually took like 80 hours of post production work, and that isn't even including the time I spent doing pre production and production for this shot. So, why did this take so long? Well, the simple answer is that it had to go through the creative process. It took me about 63 hours to figure out what exactly I wanted this shot to look like once I had the footage. And then once that final look was nailed down, it took about 8 hours to finish the compositing. It is worth noting that half of the 63 hours was spent in 3D creating and rendering these elements, so it wasn't necessarily all compositing, although it was a large portion of it. So, as we can see, figuring out the exact look and feel of large visual effects shots is by far where the most time will be spent. If the creative vision of this shot was nailed down from the start, I would have been able to finish this in just about 8 hours. It is very rare to have that creative vision be 100% complete and done when you start a shot. Often, what happens is you work through shots and you create more and more versions, and that will actually spark and inspire new ideas that will continue to alter your creative vision. And this will keep going until you have something that you are really, really happy with, or you run out of time or budget and you need to call the shot done. So, the first step in this creative process is creating a concept for your shot. The idea for your concept can come from a myriad of sources, but the most common one in visual effects is the script. Your concept will inform all of the creative decisions you will make. In my eyes, the best shots in films are the ones that are done not only to be aesthetically pleasing, but also visually convey the story. So I try to largely incorporate those two ideas in my own concepts. So this shot right here was not inspired by a script, but actually it was inspired by a bunch of art that I found on ArtStation. ArtStation is a really great place to brainstorm visual ideas because there's just some unbelievably talented people on there, and they're always posting new works of art. And I do want to say, you should note, you should be inspired to create by these works of art and not directly copy them. So, anyways, I was beginning to hone in on the aesthetic for this shot, kind of based on what I saw on ArtStation. I know that I really liked the moody, overcast tone that these images had, but I also really liked the slightly apocalyptic sci fi vibe. And so I had one part of my concept down, the aesthetic, but I still needed to come up with some sort of backstory for my shot. And at the beginning, I settled on a story that was very similar to what I felt was communicated right here: a lone sci fi traveler moving towards an ominous, abandoned structure in some sort of apocalyptic future. I didn't know exactly what this structure would look like, but I was confident I would find it along the way. The story to your shot can be very simple, like this one. There's nothing really revolutionary about this backstory, but it is incredibly helpful when it comes to making creative decisions down the road. So now I had my aesthetic and rough story down, and I also had to keep in mind that I was working on this to be made for a class. I wanted to teach with this shot in particular about making matte paintings, projecting them, using photography to make that matte painting. And I also really wanted to have a photo real character, from footage that we would incorporate into a CG foreground. So, with my story, aesthetic, and class requirements in mind, I began working. So, while I was waiting for an overcast day in always sunny Los Angeles, I began working on my CG foreground. And you can tell exactly how much I was inspired by this image because I was just trying to match the texture and look of the ground as a starting point to see if I could get the feel right. And as I'm going through these, it's also good to keep in mind you can see exactly how long it took me to get to each of those spots. I kept the hours kind of in the file name just to keep track of where I was at a given point in time. So you can always look there if you're ever curious. Anyways, I added a few trees again, very inspired by that main image to see how they would look, and I began to play with options for the CG buildings in the background. Those ended up being a little bit too brutalist for my taste, and I felt like buildings like that belonged in a Blade Runner kind of concrete jungle rather than in a more organic environment like the one I was going for, so I got rid of them. Then an overcast day finally came, and I was able to record the footage for this shot. So I did this little test comp of my CG ground with the real footage. I thought it was looking pretty nice, but it still didn't quite fit the sci fi aspect that I was looking for. I also thought it was missing a focal point in our background, so I added a very large structure right here. But when I did that, I didn't really like how this was feeling in terms of scale. The model just didn't quite feel big enough, even though it was sized up to be quite big, and it just didn't really make sense to me. And so I went back and looked through ArtStation for more references, and that's when I found this image. I really liked the contrast between the desolate foreground and the more luscious background. The kind of burnt and broken down trees in the foreground I thought made really interesting silhouettes against the very green landscape and waterfall, and this is when I made my first significant creative change. I added more details to my backstory. Instead of just having a lone sci fi traveler moving towards an abandoned structure, I would now have him traveling, coming out of a very burnt, desolate area and moving towards a green area with water that just feels a little bit more lively. I still wanted to keep the sci fi building aspect and keep the area feeling a little bit ominous and abandoned. So I set out on finding photographs that would work for my revamped concept and ended up creating this. It was my first layout pass of what this concept could look like. And I also temped in some trees to the previous version to see if this new concept could work there as well. But I ended up settling for the waterfall look and did some additional work on that. In this image, I laid out some futuristic buildings and trees, as well as testing out that terrible whale skeleton to the left. I felt like the buildings in the background were working fairly well, but now I needed to work on my burnt foreground. This is where we are about 26 hours into the shot, and some of the pieces are starting to feel pretty good together. I continued adding various tree elements to the foreground, and in this iteration, they're definitely laughably small and feel out of scale. I also thought that adding a fence to separate the green grass from the wasteland was an interesting idea, almost like it was implying in this world any lush area with plant life was kind of restricted or protected. And so, yeah, I felt pretty good about the setup at this point, and I did a texture pass on all of the buildings. And my main issue with this shot currently was that compositionally, it was quite hard to pick out our foreground character. I thought the focus on the waterfall was pretty nice, but the character was definitely getting lost in this very busy background. So I tried brightening up those more domed buildings to see if he would read better, but it wasn't quite working for me. I do think this updated fence looks pretty interesting. I like that the barbed wire, the razor wire, kind of implies at one point it was a very secure area. But the fact that it's kind of broken into and knocked down and maybe a little bit rusted implies that it hasn't been that way for quite some time. And that just kind of fed into the more ominous sci fi building. So I thought that was really interesting. And as I kept working on this, I was not sure if the shot was getting a little bit too busy overall. It's always good to be aware of your own tendencies, and one of mine that I have is to fill up the frame with more and more elements when something is off, but that'll typically leave the shot with just a bit too much going on. So I did a version where I stripped out a lot of the CG just to see what it would look like, and I thought the shot looked cleaner, but the main issue with it in this state was it didn't really feel like there was any depth. I tried another version to see if a more accurately scaled foreground would help, but again, this is just a little bit muddy and it's hard to pick out the character. And so I was looking between this version and the previous, and I realized I had been kind of ignoring the third and most important consideration of my concept, and that is that this is for a class, and I want to have a background matte painting that uses photography. Right now, the shot has so much CG in it that there wouldn't really be much room to create an interesting matte painting. So, while I do think this version of the shot could be wrestled into looking pretty nice, I decided to backtrack a few steps and focus on the deep background. The main issue we had in this bare bones version was depth, so I really focused on fixing that. This was the second big shift that happened to the kind of creative vision and the process, and I spent about 10 hours looking through photographs, largely through Photobash, and I finally pieced together a concept that I really, really liked. It felt open and clean, there's a clear silhouette for a foreground character, and I thought it looked really interesting. So then the tweaks from this point began to get more and more minor as the visual concept had finally been nailed down. The tweaks I made were mostly about selling the scale of our scene through adding some small trees in our midground and modifying the silhouette of our deep background mountain to the far right. And so from there, like I said, the tweaks were just cleaning up small details and adding a final sense of haze over the deep background. So, to summarize, this shot took me about 63 hours of work to finalize my creative concept, and then another 15 hours on top of it to update my CG, find additional matte painting photography, and final the compositing. If we had the final shot to reference from the beginning and all the elements to just kind of drop in and start working, this would have taken very little time to complete, as we'll see throughout these next 2 weeks. But figuring out exactly what this shot should look like took about 80% of the time. And I think it's really important to keep this in mind when you're learning from any sort of compositing tutorial or course. The creative process has been figured out beforehand. You're learning the techniques and tools the compositor used to assemble the final shot, but not necessarily how that final shot came to be. And so that's why tutorials can really make amazing shots so quickly. The time consuming part of the creative process and debugging your shot has been figured out beforehand. Something that is also worth mentioning in this video is that this shot did not solely come from me. After most of these iterations, I would show my very talented friends who are VFX artists and I would ask them for their feedback, because I know it's very easy to just kind of have blinders on your eyes when you're working on your own shot for so long. It's very, very easy to just be oblivious to very clear issues. And their feedback was a huge factor in getting this shot to look like it does today. And I mean, it makes sense that you should always ask for feedback because all the shots you see in film and television have had countless rounds of notes given on them. So why should your own personal work be any different if we aspire to be to that level? So that's kind of my bit on the creative process, perhaps a little off topic for this compositing course, but I thought it would be helpful and informational. And if you're ever wondering how are they doing this so fast in tutorials, it's because you're only seeing about 20% of the time it actually took to make very complicated shots. So yeah, that's kind of what I have for you. In our next video, we're going to take a look at setting up default values in Nuke. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.